heavy metal.
That's right.
Currently,
That's the
not
way to
on
do it.
new wave, but still a very active band about that scenes.
Yeah. I'm just gonna really quick switch to my cable internet. So I might drop out for 1 second. I'll just be 1 sec. Let's see if this works.
Okay. Yes. Okay. See you in within 2-3 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Looks like I'm back now. Great. All right. Well,
getting better.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, I guess I'll mute my mic, I'll mute my camera, and I'll wait a couple of minutes, and then we'll get started, right?
Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, I check the prepared screen for the event. You can move them. Okay. Eh, 待機スライド出します。スライドは出した。レコーディングはスタートさせた。YouTube ライブは始めた。あとあれか、全員に連絡だ。メールも送信しました。これで準備 OK。関さんは今日入れるかな？一応連絡入れます。
どうもーす。
ご無沙汰です。はい。
Hello.
Okay, all speakers prepared already. I introducing the Hiro and Haruseki, both of translating teams. Today, most of the question from the Hiro. He is a very famous creator and also critic in Japan. And also we translating together most of his works. And Haruseki is a Japanese largest civic tech community called Code for Japan's founder and main organizer. He did a great job with the Japanese government, with open innovation, with community works.
Hello. Great to see you.
Yeah, today we doing a discussion with these four speakers, and just start 5-6 minutes. I introducing you about the books in Japanese for the people with coming here delay because of online. That's the reason why I start 5-10 minutes. I will talking about using my PPT. と言いながら今、山形さんが起きていた。大丈夫かなOkay, okay. The time has coming. We start the event in on time. Yes. Today's event, we だから今日のイベントは、Zoom、ウェビナー、いつも使っている、皆さんが使っている Zoom ミーティングと、ちょっと違う、アプリケーションを使って行います。Q&A 機能とチャット機能、どちらもあります。Q&A は我々、パネリストしか見えないようになっています。で、チャットは全員が見れるようにすることができます。どっちを使ってもらっても大丈夫で、Q&A の方が、他の人に見れないんで、それで質問してもらうことが多いです。でも、どっちも歓迎です。で、今日のイベントは、レコーディングしてて、YouTube ライブにも、投げてて、なるべくたくさんの人に見てもらいたいと思っています。録画してシェアもするつもりです。ハッシュタグは、遠くへ行きたければです。で、レコーディングや切り取り、どちらも全部歓迎なので、いろんなところでシェアしてもらうことを、お待ちしています。よろしくお願いします。で、ちょっと最初5分ぐらい、前説で簡単にPeople Powered、遠くへ行きたければみんなへ行けの内容紹介と、なぜ出版したかという話をします。今日はメインゲストは何しろジョノ・ベーコンで、ジョノ・ベーコンコンサルティングの、CEO であり、Ubuntu や GitHub や XPRIZE などのコミュニティマネージャーとしてキャリアを開始して、もともとエンジニアだったんだけれども、その後コミュニティを中心に見るようになっていて、今はコミュニティのコンサルティングで、が一番の仕事になってます。で、コミュニティについての著作や、ポッドキャストやイベントでコミュニティリーダーシップサミットっていうのをやっていて、今、彼のウェブサイトを見ると、0から12週間でコミュニティを構築する講座っていうのをオンラインで主催しています。彼が書いた本が、この People Powered っていう本で、日本語のタイトルは、遠くへ行きたければみんなへ行けという本になってます。で、本の内容紹介は300ページぐらいある分厚い本だけど、内容が具体的で細かいだけで大意はシンプルで、最初の100ページはコミュニティがどういうもので何ができるか、人同士は何でこう参加するのか、でコミュニティはコミュニティのみんなでいろんなものを作るっていうタイプのコミュニティもあれば、みんなで同じものを好きになって、でなんで好きかっていうのを交流させて、好きを大きくするみたいなタイプのコミュニティ、大きく分けて3つぐらいのサイズのコミュニティが、3つぐらいの目的のコミュニティがあって、それぞれの目的ごとに運営のやり方が違うよとか、それでも3つにはそれぞれ共有するものがあって、その中でコミュニティを 大きくしていって、で、よく運営していって、結果としてたくさんの成果を生んでいくために、具体的な詳細なガイドラインが、本の中で紹介されていて、で、ジョノ・ベイコの自分のコンサルティングの経験から、会社がコミュニティやる上でよくある失敗などのケースなども、あと書かれている、ビジネス書としてコミュニティを作るために、とてもよく使える本になってます。で、実際、一個一個のフェーズについて、人がコミュニティに入っていくためには、どんどんソーシャルキャピタルを積み上げていく必要がある。例えば、人がコミュニティに入っていくために、最初まずアクセスして、それから何かしらいいねをするなり、投稿するなりの貢献をして、結果としてそれが他人に褒められることで自尊心が生まれて、自尊心がどんどん続いていくと、コミュニティの中での自分のアイデンティティ、尊厳みたいなものが生まれて、で、それが自分自身の生活に何か変えるようなインパクトが生まれると、このコミュニティは自分のものだっていうふうに帰属意識が持てるみたいなものが、いうふうなステップであったり、あと人がコミュニティに入っていくときには、いくつかの行動を重ねることによって、まずカジュアルなメンバーになり、その後レギュラーなメンバーになり、全体の1割いかないような人がコアメンバーっていうふうになって、でコアメンバーになったら、コアメンバーには全体の決定もその人たちに関わってもらうように動かしていった方がいいよねみたいなことが書いてあり、こういうすごく使えるチャートがたくさん書いてあって、それぞれのフェーズにごとにどう違う、どういうところを気をつければいい、どういうふうにコミュニケーションすればいい、そういうことが書いてある、その本です。で、特にビジネス書として仕事で使えるために書いてあるので、コミュニティやボランティアワークだし、目的がみんなが楽しくするためにやることなんで、その意味でちょっとふわっと、ゴールはなんていうか明確なものではない、あんまりガチガチに決めると良くないということが書いてあるんだけれども、それ以上に具体的に数値計画かけて、レビュー計画がっちりかけて、数字を毎週毎週追い込んでいって、で全員で目的を統一することが一番大事ですということが大きく書いてあるのが、違いです。で、もともとプロの翻訳者でもない僕が、なんでこのピープルパワードの翻訳を始めたかというと、前の翻訳のハードウェアハッカーとちょっと大きく関わっている話で、最初の翻訳書のハードウェアハッカーは、ハードウェアをどう作るかっていうことがすごい詳しく書いてある本なんですよね。そこに関するエコシステムであったり、知的財産の課題であったり、ハードウェアそのもののことも書いてあるし、ハードウェアに対する人間の付き合い方みたいなことがすごく大きく書いてある。で、今回の翻訳でも一緒に翻訳してもらったというか、山形さんが一緒にやってもらってるから僕がいくつかの本の翻訳ができていて、英語の難しいところは全部山形さんの監修ががっちり入っている。だから全部の分に大体山形さんの監修は入ってるんですけど、たくさんの本を翻訳している山形さんから見ても、このハードウェアハッカーを書いているアンドリュー・バニー・ファンという人は、これはいい意味で頭がおかしいんじゃないかっていうぐらいに、ある意味、おかしいことは書いて、おかしい物理法則に反することは書いてないんだけど、人間にこんなことができるんだっていう意味でとんでもないことがたくさん書いてある、すごい本だったんですね。で、僕はこの本を翻訳したことで、今、スイッチサイエンスという会社でオープンソースハードウェアを作る、仕事ができているので、ある意味、キャリアを作ってくれた本でもありますと。で、それで、ハードウェアに関して仕事をするようになったときに、言っても僕はハードウェアでご飯を食べているし、もっとそれ以上にコミュニティでご飯を食べている。僕らがスイッチサイエンスが売ってるハードウェアっていうのは、そのハードウェアを好きな人がいて、ブログとか書いてくれて、情報を共有してくれて、他の人に勧めてくれるから、次のハードウェアが売れるので、その意味ではハードウェアを売る以上にコミュニティを売っているので、それで、オープンハードウェアに対する興味がどんどん上がってきた。で、もともと今みたいな商売を始めようとしたきっかけが、ガラントバザール、カシードラランドバザールっていう、リック・レイモンドが書いたオープンソース界の、なんていうか、有名になる一番最初の本みたいな、もう10年以上前に書かれた、ネット上の論文で、これも山形さんが翻訳してくれて、で、この本、この原稿良いですよね、ここで書いてあることすごい大事ですよねということを、で、ピープルパワードの内容も、このガラントバザールにかなりつながるものがありますよねということをいろんなところで、説明していたら、その中で、昔からオープンソース友達だった、関さんが、コードフォージャパンの活動の中で、ガラントバザールをたくさん引用したりしていた。で、その後いろんな、コミュニティにコミットしていくうちで、中国の、チャイニーズオープン、コスコン、チャイナオープンソースカンファレンス、チャイナオープンソースカンファレンス、2020で、ジョノ・ベーコンがキーノートスピーカーをやっていて、で、そのキーノートスピーカーとしてピープルパワードの内容を紹介していて、その中で アパッチウェイとしてコミュニティオーバーコードとか、コミュニティをどういうふうに大きくしていくかが、これから先のオープンソースについて、コードを書くことよりも、コミュニティをどうメインテンしていくかみたいなことが、むしろ大事になっているみたいなことを紹介していて、すごく良いことを言っているし、ここで言ってることについて、僕はそんなにちゃんと分かってるわけでもないなと思って、すごい大きいインパクトを受けたわけです。で、その大きいインパクトを受けて、この People Powered の本の英語版を、Amazon で見て、で、読んでみて、スターいっぱいついてるし、なんていうか、紹介してくれてる人が日本にないタイプの産業をすごく出している、X プライズの、ピーター・ダイヤモンド博士とか、あと、他にもレコメンドしているのが、レッドハットのジム・ホワイト・ファーストとか、リンクドインの、リンキンパークの、マイク・シノダとか、Linux ファウンデーションのジム・ゼムリンとか、そういう、いろんな、日本にあまりないタイプの、人たちがレコメンドしてくれていると。で、これは日本に紹介した方が良いタイプの本だろうと。なので、仕事の間の時間で翻訳をして、中身をもっと調べてみて、で、日本でいろんな人が読めるように日本語で出版しようというふうに思って、最初まず山形さんに相談して、OK、ちょっとやりましょうという話になって、それで技術評論者の方にも OK をもらって、それで日本語版になってます。で、いろいろ翻訳を始めた後で、良い内容なんだけど、でも良いコミュニティを作るやり方って、ある意味、読むと1ページ1ページは当たり前のことが書いてあるような内容にも見えて、なので、ハードウェアハッカーみたいに、もうとにかく読んでくださいっていう本っていうよりは、もう少し本の内容が具体的にどういうところにどう効くのかを、細かく説明していく、具体的な例みたいなものを貯めていかないと、良さが伝わらないだろうなというふうに思っていたときに、一緒にイベントをやった、コードフォージャパンの関さんが、と一緒に、身も蓋もない日中オープンソースの話というイベントをやったときに、関さんがそこで発表してくださったガランとバザールとオープンガバメントっていう、資料がすごく良い資料で、発表もすごく良くて、で、まさにこの本に書いてあるようなコミュニティによる、シビックテックを一番上手にやってるなと。で、関さんももちろんものすごい忙しい人ではあるんですけど、ちょっとお願いして、なんとかこの本で、コードフォージャパンの紹介の内容とこの本の内容を結びつけて、解説を書いてくださいっていうふうにお願いしたら、ネット上のブログでも多分一番解説の評判が良くなるぐらい、すごく良い、解説が書かれていて、それで、本としてすごく良い本になったなというふうには思っています。で、今日のイベントは、その、関さんと翻訳のメインの部分をやってくれた山形さんと一緒になって、その著者のジョノ・ベーコンにいろんなものを聞いていこうという、イベントです。ですね。で、こうやって、ピープルパワードであり、ハードウェアハッカーであり、あと山形さんがこの間訳されたヨハン・ノルベリのオープンであり、そのオープンイノベーションでオープンになること、そのためにオープンソースに近い活動をすること、情報をシェアしていくこと、そこが広まって、で結果としてコードフォージャパンみたいな活動や M5 スタックのコミュニティが日本で広がっているみたいな事例がもっともっと出てくるようになるといいなというのが、この本に関わったみんなの人の、思いではあります。ということで、Let's starting the talk session with Jono. Please, short self-introduction from you, Jono.
Hey, you say introduction from me?
Yes, introduction from you.
Okay, great. Thank you. That all sounded great. I have no idea what you just said, but it sounded fantastic, whatever it was. So my Japanese is non-existent. So first of all, thank you for inviting me onto this. And I appreciate you taking the time and people tuning in and watching. So my name is Jono. I'm incredibly passionate about communities. So I firmly believe that communities are the way in which we build amazing things. Whether you want to build a business, an open source project, if you want to build a place where people who share the same interest, whether it's games or, you know, music or whatever, I think it's the way in which we become the best we can be as human beings. But communities are incredibly difficult to build. They're complicated, they're error prone. So I've devoted my life to figuring out how to do that. And, you know, I used to lead community at Canonical, XPRIZE, and GitHub. And then I realized about 6 years ago, I wanted to start my own business and go out there and consult with lots of different companies so I could learn more about different types of companies. I work with all kinds of different companies, from big companies like Microsoft, Airbnb, Intel, Deutsche Bank, Samsung, through to really early companies who were just getting started. And then, you know, I've written some books, People Powered and the Art of Community. I've got a course I've got a masterclass called the Zero to Community Masterclass, where I train people how to build a community in 12 weeks. Lots of fun stuff going on. So,
yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Today, Hiro will bring some questions for you. I sent an email already. We start from that slide to basic question. 山形さん、パワーポイント出ますかね。
そちらで出していただけますか。ちょっとね、
出ます
こちらのパソコンの評判が非常に悪いので。
了解です。OK. I send the basic question to you in the email, and in the PPT is just translated. Same questions. I start to screen share.
Okay.
Okay.
So that I don't have to translate the questions into Japanese every time, so to save time.
Perfect.
So the first, maybe I say basic question is, so could you explain the background for you writing this book? Is there a strong demand for this community around the product or service in America, or is it something that you think is neglected right now, so you wanted to share people with your knowledge and how to do it, or the importance of it, or what was your basic start point for writing this book?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a little bit of backstory to this. So,
Okay.
the first book I wrote in community was called The Art of Community, and I wrote that about 14 years ago. Was when the first edition came out.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, I hadn't seen any books that provided a practical guide for how to build a community. My goal was share what I knew at that point, which was, in retrospect, very limited, and write that down so people had something to start with. And I made the decision back then to write a book, start a conference, which was the Community Leadership Summit, and then to start consulting with people so I could learn more than just the world that I knew. And that was fine. But what I found when so what happened was, I started a consulting business, and I started working with all kinds of different companies, and I'd get on calls with, CEOs of companies or CMOs of companies. And in many cases, so I don't do any marketing for my consulting. Most of my clients come in either because it's word of mouth, or I was referred to them, or they saw some of the stuff I've been doing and they reach out. So I'd get on these calls with people I didn't know, and they'd say, "Oh, I've just bought your book. I'm excited to read it." And I was thinking, okay, first of all, The Art of Community, I'm very proud of it, but that book it's quite old. It talks about Google Plus in that book. That's how old it is. It also was very much of a book designed for people like me at the time. Community managers on the ground, knee deep in all of the detail and technology and all the rest of it. It really isn't designed for, people who don't know a lot about communities and why they should care. So my worry was, okay, if people go and buy The Art of Community, and let's say it's the CEO of a small startup, they're going to get drowned within 10 pages, and they're going to get bored because, The Art of Community, it's had 2 editions. It's about 600 pages, massive. So I realized I needed to write something that was going to be the kind of book you can pick up at an airport. That's 250 pages. It's a business book, and it introduces the value proposition of a community. But the thing that annoys me about business books is and I don't know if you guys have experienced this, you go and buy a business book and you read it and you're like, that was fascinating. Now what? Like, what do I do with it? So I wanted to write a business book that actually had some really practical application. It wasn't just a bunch of ideas. And that was one of the most difficult things I've ever done, was writing people power, because a business book is only about 250, 280 pages. And there's not a lot of room. A lot of people, when they've asked me about writing books, they say, "Oh, how do you write that many words?" And the problem with people powered was not writing enough words. It was trying to cram it in to the amount of space that I had. And just knowing that my audience here, I couldn't assume anything. Like I the only thing I could assume was that whoever picked that book up may have no idea what a community is. They may see that other people are building communities, and they should be able to get started and get value out of it. Or somebody who's building communities for years should be able to get value out of it. And that was really the goal around it. One final point as well, real quick, is I also kind of wanted to write a business book. I wanted to write a book with a major publisher. And I discovered that is a very complicated process. You can't just go to HarperCollins, who were my publisher, and pitch them a book. You've got to get an agent. And then, I spent 6 months just putting the proposal together. The proposal was nearly 40 pages long just to pitch the book to them. So it's a very, like, my proposal to O'Reilly when I wrote The Art of Community was about half a page. So it's a very, very different world.
So just about the publishing business. So you write the proposal. Don't they approach you to write a book? The publisher approaches you to write a book. You have to propose to them?
Yeah, so with O'Reilly, they had an idea about maybe putting together a book previously. But I went to them and said, hey, I'm interested in writing a book about community. I already had a relationship with O'Reilly because I'd written another book. I'd co-authored a book through O'Reilly. And I knew that the team there, and it was a very lightweight process. But there's a type of publishing called trade publishers, which is the Penguins, the HarperCollins, the big publishers. And the problem, so I had this kind of desire to write a book with them. I knew from a friend of mine that you needed an agent. So the first step for me was find an agent. And it took me probably 6 months to find an agent. And part of it was just getting people to take me seriously, because the kind of people who get books published through those big publishers are people like Hillary Clinton, like famous people, not John O'Baker. And, and they expect to sell a lot of copies of these books as well. Whereas, community is still relatively niche. So yeah, it was a long process. And then once I got the book deal, once we'd signed it, the timelines are so long. When I signed the contract for People Powered, the deadline to submit it to them was a year later. Whereas with O'Reilly, I wrote the book and it was out 2 months later. So it's just a very different world. I wouldn't recommend it. If you're going to write, if anyone's watching this and you want to write a book, do not go to a trade publisher. They're good people, but there's easier ways to do it. So
I see. Okay, but that the publishing part was a side thing, man. But reading the book initially, Mr. Takasu came to me about the translation of this book, and I read it. The first reaction I had was that I've been with various communities of free software or various document creation or whatever, and first initial impression I had when I read your book was that this guy is trying to teach techniques about how to just manipulate and use people into doing your biddings and just doing marketing for your service and products. And this is really kind of icky. So is there that kind of reaction to you writing this kind of book? People react.
Maybe several yes. Also in Japan, there's some
negatively to this book.
I haven't seen. I haven't seen a reaction like that, fortunately, because that's the last thing I'd want anyone to think. So a couple of thoughts on this. Communities as a principle, it's people coming together, and the way I look at it is, to me, the shining star of what a community and why I'm so passionate about them is that, if you've got 50 people, right, that's 50 different brains. And each one of those brains has got experience and ideas. They've tried things that have worked. They've tried things that haven't worked. They've got various amounts of time. And when we only keep all of that genius and insight inside of that individual, then only the individual can benefit. Whereas to me, what's so amazing about communities is when we can get all of that in those 50 brains out into a shared space where everybody can share and collaborate. That's the real magic behind what makes us human. Now, some people could do that in a negative capacity, right? People could create a community that's focused on illegal acts or scamming people or things like that. So there is a dark side potentially to community. I haven't seen people worry too much about, I mean, pretty much 99% of the people who ever reach out to me and share feedback about the book or want to work with me as a consultant or join my masterclass or whatever, they're building communities around a business, or they're building communities around an ethos or a mission, or maybe people who've got a shared medical condition or something along those lines. But there is the capacity of people using these things in a negative way. To me, what mitigates that is if anyone watching this, if you ever join any environment where you feel like you're being manipulated, then just don't do it. My goal with my community work is not about manipulation. It's more about creating a journey. So the analogy I often use is a community is a shared space, right? So where a group of us come together, and you can think of it like a theme park. Like, I don't know if you guys have been to Disney World or whatever. Imagine Disney World, but there's no rides, right? Well, a lot of communities, it's just Q&A. People go and ask questions and they get help. And that's boring. It's not very interesting. Whereas to me, the best communities are where you've got lots of attractions. People are creating content, they're running events, they're running mentoring programs, they're providing rewards and inspiration, and all that kind of stuff is what makes communities exciting. So my focus is, how do we make that predictable? How do we give people a really clear set of guardrails so they can create an exciting, interesting environment that keeps people coming back?
I see. Now, I've recently seen some commercial companies that say, okay, we will take care of your communities and make and maintain it, and just make this whole community happen around your product. And of course, some people have negative reaction against commercialization in general. They say, these companies are coming in and now they're trying to make this into an industry. Now, but do you see any difference between, let's say, communities run and operated by a commercial entity and this kind of what some might say authentic community that automatically, autonomously happen? Is there any difference in those kind of communities?
This is such a great question. And it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit recently. This is a very blunt statement, and some people will disagree with it. But in my mind, if you're a company and you've got a product or a service and you want a community that's wrapped around your product or your service, then the success in building a community is not, you can't just hire a person to do that, in my mind. You can hire a community manager who comes and works for your company, and they may lead all the tactics and the strategy in how you do that. But the very best companies, the very best commercial communities, like a community wrapped around a company, are ones where the community ethos is baked into the company. So I'll give you an example. One of my first, when I went full time as a consultant, because I was consulting for about 7 years on the side before I went full time. When I went full time, one of my first clients was this company called HackerOne that's based in San Francisco. And their CEO is this guy called Martin Mikos, who used to be CEO of MySQL and of Eucalyptus, and a very, very well-known, very successful CEO. And he's a good friend of mine. And when he joined HackerOne as their CEO, because they had a couple of founders and they needed a new CEO. And he brought the whole team together and he said, we're going to build a community around HackerOne, and every single person in this company has to play a role in that community. He said, I don't care whether you're an executive or whether you are a junior engineer. Our community wants to talk to us. They don't just want to talk to the community manager. That we are part of our own community, right? And I love that. And he's 100% right. So to me, hiring a company that just goes and quote unquote builds a community for you, I just don't buy it. Like, I think that you need to bake those skills into the business. Also, it's inauthentic. Like, if somebody goes and and builds a community for you and they don't work for you, it doesn't sit quite right with me. Where I think there is an exception to this is that there are just mechanics of the things you need to do to build a community. Like, for example, you need to create a lot of content when you run a community, or you need to create swag, or you need to run events. All of those things can be outsourced. No problem with that. With the core like leadership and strategy and community building, I think you need to do it yourself.
I see. Okay. So, but then I go to the next part. 次のスライドお願いします。
Yes. Next one. Yes.
Oh.
The management of the community. Yes.
Yeah. So that question, that answer kind of brings me to the next part, which is like the management of the community. And first, probably people read the book and think that, oh, the community needs a lot of pampering. You have to, just start people and set up reward systems, and then constantly watch what people are doing, and then you have to do this, that, and it's kind of a lot of work involved in operating a community. So it doesn't. First of all, it doesn't seem very easy. It seems a lot of work and hard. Are people surprised to find that out, or is that what usually many of your readers expect? They just don't know how to actually do it. Do they?
Yeah.
I mean, first thing, my backstory. I started with these community things with this online forums and free software communities. And when free software, open source software first became popular, there was this consensus among the business people that you just open your source and just people will come and fix your bugs and improve it. That's wonderful. And then of course no such thing happens. And people say, that's not what we expected. This is totally bullshit. And then they went away from free software altogether, and they just didn't buy into this community thing. So with your book, is there responses like that? People saying that this is not what we expect from communities, or or people just read correctly into what you're saying? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's a view out there, and I think it's a very prevalent view that you can just put a forum online, or you can just put a Slack channel online, or a Matamos channel, or a ISC channel, whatever it might be, Discord, and people show up. And in reality, for the majority of people who want to build a community, it doesn't work that way. Like, people don't just show up. The whole, if you build it, they will come. It exists in a very small set of circumstances. And the idea that you just put a platform online and people show up and they kind of self-organize. The only real instances where that can happen is when the community is what I would call a disruptive community, right? Okay. So you mentioned free software, and I think this is a good example. In the early days of free software and open source, communities just formed, right? They didn't need to have like all the things I talk about in people powered. A lot of that stuff wasn't necessary. People just showed up and they self-organized and started doing things. But the reason why that happened largely was because the idea of people around the world building software that was freely available, it became part of this like ethical mission, right? And you have some people on the hard left of that ethical mission who are the free software crowd, where everything has to be free. And then you have people further on the right side of that mission who are like more like shared source or open source or whatever. But fundamentally what united all of those folks was just this notion of this is a better way of building software. And I identify as an open source, as a free software person. I mean, that was my experience. That's how I got into this whole world. So when you have that kind of disruption, we're seeing this with Web3. We've seen this in many cases with like fitness communities where people really want to, help people to lose weight or to get fitter or whatever. Then if you build it, they will come can work. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people who want to build communities do not have that kind of disruptive mission, right? If you have a webinar platform that you're selling, there's no disruptive mission with a webinar platform. And no matter how much you try to, we're going to change the world of online event, no one cares. It's going to be difficult to do that. So for most people, They want to build a community around a product or a service, something along those lines. And that's why you need a lot more of, you need to create an environment that's really dynamic to get people in. So the reason why I structure it this way is that every community can benefit from creating a journey, from creating, having content and conversations and rewards and the metrics and metric-driven development and all that kind of stuff they cover and people-powered. Even like really disruptive communities can benefit from that. Sadly, I think a lot of people who don't have those big disruptive communities throw a forum online or a Slack channel, and then no one shows up, or they have a blip at the beginning and then people never come back, and they get really demotivated. And the reason why is because your community is competing with Netflix. It's competing with Dungeons and Dragons. It's competing with PlayStation. It's competing with bands and family and all the rest of it. So we have to create something really compelling to really make it work.
I see. I see. So my next question was that, can we really dream about this autonomous community where you build it and people will come, but probably that'll depend on the type of the product or the service that you're offering. And probably times have changed, I should say, from the initial days of open source software communities and lots of the many products are competing days of today. So probably that's the difference that you used to have in the communities that exist today, probably.
Well, yeah, I mean, I there's two thoughts on that, because I'd say, like, when you have when somebody has a really big idea, an exciting, disruptive idea, I think you can literally just build it and they will come. But those huge, big, disruptive ideas where people can really play, the key thing is being able to play a role in the disruption, right? So if we look at open source as an example, and I hate using the word disruption because it's so overused by like frustrating marketing people, but I need to think of a better term for it, maybe impact. But like, I mean, a good example is Ubuntu. Like, I really learned a lot of my early experience working at Canonical, building Ubuntu, the Ubuntu community. And, everybody who joined that community was an Ubuntu user. But a major reason why people join that community is because they felt part of this global mission towards open source. And consequently, when you have people who have that kind of mission, they're much more engaged, they're much more passionate, and will self-organize and all the rest of it. So we will have those kinds of disruptive communities happening today in other places. We're seeing, if you think about the impact of AI, if you think about decentralization, if you think about the fight for privacy, if you think about social efforts like women's rights, trans rights, gay rights, these are all very disruptive things that people will self-organize around. So if you've got something like that, I think you can do that. Where I think when we use the word automation, where I think there is an opportunity for automation in the non-disruptive communities is in optimizing how we work together, right? So I'll give you an example.
Okay.
One thing everybody who's watching this, if you've got a community, everyone who's watching this should do is when you create a blog post or a YouTube video, you create a piece of content or a podcast, or let's say this video, right, or this YouTube stream, take it, trim it into bits. So let's say, in our session today, there might be 5 questions that are particularly interesting that you answered with particularly interesting responses from me. Trim those 5 individual bits of content out and then put them online separately, and then take them and add them to your blog, and then take them and add them to your email list. So take content and reuse it. So what you do is you create a workflow where you don't have to think about it. You just, that, okay, when I do something, I've got 5 questions, I'll trim them out, I'll put them on the website, I'll put them in my email, and you connect all these pieces together. It's not completely automated, but what it does is it's a workflow that makes it easier to get lots of content together and put it out there. So to me, there's a huge opportunity for every community to do that. Like, how do we regularly review our metrics and data? How do we integrate social media with other things? Like, that's where I think there's a lot of automation opportunity available.
I see.
Yeah.
The next point is, okay, so, well, suppose once you got your service and you got your communities up, Now, maintaining it is also another very difficult area. And I kind of feel that once the product or the service reach a certain level of maturity, the community tends to stagnate. There can only be so many facts or installation guides, the next low-hanging fruit for the newbies would newbies would be rather become higher and higher. And so it becomes very difficult for a new user to come in and use it. And the next point would be that the old timers would always be there, and then they would start acting rather patronizing ways. And that'll tend to chase out the new people, new entrants. And then sometimes they would start resisting change in the products. And another point is that in many free softwares, community becomes rather more of a burden. They would demand the developers to do this, do that, do my bidding, whatever. We're the community, you listen to us. And so they become completely exhausted and quit the development altogether. So how do you have any ideas of how to maintain the community, how to keep the actual product and the community in a healthy relationship? Do you have any points or comments on that?
So that's a big question. I think we should break it into two pieces. So I think one piece that you were asking about there was how to stop it stagnating. And then the second piece, I think, is how to deal with the old timers, the old guard, who are not necessarily old in terms of age. They've just been around the community for a long time, right? So in terms of how to avoid stagnation, communities that stagnate aren't good communities. You're doing it wrong if your community stagnates, in my mind. And the reason why I say that is that I think the problem with a lot of communities is the problem with a lot of businesses and the problem with a lot of projects is that there's kind of two levels in my mind. There's like a benefits layer and then there's a functionality layer, right? So a lot of communities, especially tech communities, they operate at a functional layer, which is what I think you're talking about here. Like they have a community that provides functional resources. Like you can go and ask a question and you can go and get an answer, those kinds of things. And those become boring quickly if that's all you do. That's one of the reasons why one of my pet peeves is communities that are just Q&A, because they're completely uninteresting. Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, I'm going to go and answer questions on the internet, right? So they always burn out. To me, when we look at the benefits layer, what we need to identify is, what are our audience really trying to do, right? So if you take a community, let's say, for example, let's say it's a photography community. I don't know anything about photography, right? A functional layer could be people can go and ask questions about how to take good photos, right? Or maybe that you could create a lens guide so they can go and look at the latest lenses and pick one out. But those are functional benefits. What I want to do is I want to say, well, what are our community really like? What are they really trying to do here? Well, one is probably like create amazing photos. They're probably trying to sell their photos. They're probably trying to start businesses. They're probably trying to go from something that they're not excited about doing, like weddings, to doing something that they are excited about doing, like live bands, right? And then what are the pain points that they struggle with? Well, they're trying to do a lot and they don't have a lot of money, or they're trying to figure out how to sell their pictures. They're trying to figure out how to sell things without them being stolen on the internet. So I think when we look at that higher level and then we get creative in our community to serve those needs, that's when you create an environment that is irresistible to be in, right? If you go to a community and it's just Q&A, boring. But if you go to a community and there's mentoring programs and there's online events where people are teaching things, and maybe people are doing hot seats where they show the work that they've been working on and getting feedback from the community. Maybe there's awards ceremonies, then it stays really interesting. I think a lot of communities start to stagnate when just people run out of ideas. And typically the reason why they run out of ideas is that they're only operating at that functional layer. And that's why I think we need to change the mindset to, like, how do we create awesome value for what they really want, for what folks are really focusing on. So that's one piece. When it comes to the old guard, this has been a real problem in open source, where, and I'm sure you've all seen this, where you do get people who, where communities can't change because, quote unquote, it will irritate the community. The reason why that happens is because the social contract isn't correct. Is that we experience this a lot in Ubuntu, where we'd want to make fundamental changes in the community, but the community was set up where we had to get approval from a certain set of people to make that happen. And if I was to do it all again, I wouldn't do it that way. I think having community representation, like, community councils and, technical committees and things like that is really good. But I think, change in a community by consensus is a bad model. Because ultimately what can happen is you can get a Supreme Court in your community who have got a one way of thinking, and then, without turning it political, kind of what's happening in America right now is you have a Supreme Court that's got a certain set of perspectives, and, it's difficult to change things when people got a certain set of perspectives. So to me, where we need to be in a position of is it's not about a small group of people having a consensus. To me, it's about when we think about our audience up there, that benefit layer, is what we're doing in the community serving them? And if it isn't serving them, then it has to change. And, it may annoy some community members who've been around for a while. But what I always tell my clients is when your community's pissed off, that's a good thing. Because it means that they care. It means that they have an emotional connection to what you're doing. People don't get pissed off about the things they don't care about, right?
Right.
Like I'm sure in the last 6 months, there's been a change in America in how sheep are farmed in Wisconsin, right? I don't care. I'm not interested. But there'll be some people who really care about whatever that change is. So to me, people being pissed off is a good thing. What we need to do is we need to get to a point where we can say, we're going to make this change. It's going to be unpopular, but we need people to agree that this change will improve the overall value that our community operates on. And if you get people who stand in the way, who say no to everything, you want to get rid of those people because they're bad for you. No matter how much they produce, they're not good for your community. So.
I see. So, すみません。スライド次のにしといてください。
Yes. Okay.
Now you mentioned that getting rid of those people. What do you usually do? You kindly tell them, or you just shut down their accounts, or what are usually methods of cutting out people from a community? Right.
I think the best thing is to really humiliate them a lot on social media. No. I think the best thing to do is first of all, the most important thing with any of this is that we're always respectful and, a lot of dignity and kindness. But I think it's best to kind of, sometimes it's, I think what we need to do is we need to have a conversation. And then the way I like to do this is to basically say, okay, let's agree on what we're trying to do here, right? So let's say as an example that you've got a technical community and there's a very archaic way in which applications are reviewed before they go into a repository, as an example. And let's say you've got the old guard who like it the original way and you want to modernize it and change it. Well, the first thing I'd want to do is to go to them and say, all right, can we first all agree that there are problems with our current model, our current way of reviewing these applications. It might be slow, it might be very time consuming, or we've got a big backlog that we can't get to. So everybody ideally will say, yes, we all agree to that. So let's now talk about what a solution might look like. And what I always like to do is to start out with a proposed solution, then say, okay, this is an idea, but let's now just rip this apart and shred it and change it until it's looking something that we can get behind. And that's usually where all the disagreements will kind of shake out of. I think you want to be able to get to a point where you can always say, all right, so we've got two options on the table. We've got what we're doing right now already, and we've got this new option, which is probably not perfect. But do we agree that that option is going to better serve our audience, our community members? Because that's what we're here to do as community leaders. We're here to serve. We're here to serve and deliver amazing value, in my mind. And if these folks say, okay, I agree that it's going to better serve them, but I don't want to do it for these reasons and those reasons, whatever else, then I think it's fine to say, okay, well, we're going to proceed with this. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with, like, you just need to evaluate, is this still the place that you want to spend time? You know, is this still a place, you know, we don't have to agree on everything. Like, if you don't agree on this, we're going to do this. There's other ways in which we can all add value. And I think to me, there's got to be a period of negotiation and understanding, and make sure that emotion isn't talking, that just pure value is talking. And it's hard. I mean, it's really hard, but 9 times out of 10, it never gets to that point and people figure out a way forward. I would much rather everybody compromises at 90% than, you know, one side wins and another side doesn't win. Because to me, one of the most unhealthy things that can happen in any community, in any society, is when you have this sense of us and them. And, you know, any community that I've been a part of, when I hear anybody start saying, well, that's what they would do, and they would do this, I shut that down. Like, even if I agree with them, it's like, don't talk like that.
I see.
So.
I see. But that's sort of, well, let's say, consensus gathering. As the community becomes larger and larger, that becomes very difficult to actually, you know, talk with the community members, because it's so large and there's so many people. So would you compartmentalize it, or would you create some kind of hierarchy among the community, or what would be a nice way to do that?
That's one of the reasons why I think consensus-based decision-making is awful. Like, it's just terrible. In every single scenario, trying to get everybody to basically agree, without wishing to sound too aggressive, that's how children solve problems, right? Children make decisions based upon whether their friends will like it. And adults, in my mind, shouldn't do that. So the challenge becomes, which I think is kind of, which is, I think, where your question is leading to, is how do you, if you've got a large community, how do you make good decisions where your community feel like they've got some kind of representation? So I would recommend that any new community, any small community, you have some very clear community leaders, right? So you basically say, okay, so let's say I start a community, I'm in charge, right? I'm going to make decisions, and the goal of my decisions is to provide the best, you know, represent everybody's best interests. And that's usually okay until you start getting to a much larger group of people. What I'm a fan of is when you get to larger groups, and this is very common in open source, is where you then put together a community representation, right? And something like a community council. We did this in Ubuntu. This is very common in like Kubernetes and other projects, where you say, okay, we're going to have 5 or 7 people in the community. Everybody can apply. They can nominate themselves to be a representative. And then effectively, the community members who've done something where they've added value to the community can vote them in, right? So let's say you've got a technical community. I would say anybody who's submitted code into a repository or made some other technical contribution, they can then vote on whoever puts their hat into the ring to join that community council. And then those people now represent the community. And that's where you can have essentially a vote with that group. The key thing when you do this is you want to make sure that the scope of that community is really clear, right? So, for example, when we did this in Ubuntu, the community council could vote on things like updates to our code of conduct and how people could become members of Ubuntu. They had absolutely no power when it came to the technical decision-making of Ubuntu. We had a separate group for that called the technical board. So I think what you do is you provide a bit of power and a bit of representation to that group. And then what's nice about that is then the community feels like they've got some representation outside of me or whoever it might be. The key thing is you don't provide all power to that group. Otherwise, you can get stuck in that kind of wheel that keeps spinning around.
I see. This is how I know. 僕だけ喋ってますけど、関さんとか高須さんとかいつでも入ってくださいな。よろしくお願いします。
はい。はい。僕今むちゃくちゃキーボードを打っていってるんです。
すみません。
No problem. I'm very satisfied to join the conversation. And also that the stacking the structure is a very huge issue about the community. I still running the community about 2 or 3, but almost I found the community and maintain the community, but very hard to doing the more people to join the decision layers. I saw the people part book already. I should to making the more decision teams, not only decision part of me, but still difficult to do. Still stacking our community structure.
It's hard, right? I mean, it's I think it's the eternal leadership challenge that every single person who is watching this today will have, which is, how do I add value in the world in a way that doesn't depend on me? I suck at this. I'm terrible at this. I in many cases will think, oh, I'll just do it. And the problem is that I think if we get into that mindset of like, I'll just try to do everything myself, then we limit the ability to grow. And that's why I'm a huge fan of like creating really predictable workflows. Like how, I mean, I'll give you an example of this. So I have a masterclass. It's called Zero to Community. I'm actually about to change the name of it to the Community Experience Masterclass, but I show people in 10 weeks how to build or optimize a community. And it forced me to sit down and break down, okay, all the different steps that you go through. Like, how do you define who your audience is and what they care about? How do you create the value proposition for your community? And broke it down into all these steps. And it was hard work doing it. But what's nice about it is it taught me how to break complex things down into simple ways of doing things. So for example, I could say to you, if we think about the idea of running an online event, right? There's a million different ways in which you could run an online event, but I have a recipe, right? So if you're going to run a 1 hour session, what I like to do is intro. You have 2 or 3 people do what I call a share, which is where they share the screen for 5 minutes and share something that they've learned. Then you have a topic, and you have a set of breakout discussions on that topic. Then you provide some recognition at the end of the session, you wrap up. And it's a recipe. And I find that with communities or businesses or whatever, when you take a complex thing like running an online event or teaching people a topic, or it could be setting up a studio, or it could be recording a song, or whatever it might be, whatever your topic is, if you break it down into step-by-step instructions, then you can, in the same way that I know we've got technical folks here, in the same way that people contribute code to an open source project and it gets better, if you get the community to always improve the recipe of how you do these different things, like I shared my recipe there for running an online event, but I'm sure some of you would say, well, you can make it better if you did it this way. That's how we scale out our communities.
Can I ask a question regarding the kind of, you said predictable workflow, and you mentioned Web3 several times, and I'm curious about that topic. And there has been a lot of discussions about Web3 in Japan, but I feel that that the expectations are too high. Maybe I stopped.
Oh, you broke up for me for a second there. Yeah. I don't know if it's just me or whether.
Yeah. You're interested in Web3 and
Web3, yeah. And I feel expectation about Web3 is too high, I feel personally. But but especially DAO is a topic about decentralized community building, right? So I'm curious, do you think that various elements that the DAO promotes, like token economics or NFTs or open contracting things, it will significantly change the way of building communities? Like maybe it can be used for making some predictable workflows like that. So do you think it is possible to use such technologies to
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, to me, a predictable workflow is about producing a complex outcome and breaking it down into manageable steps. Because I think, when you look at people who are successful and people who are less successful, I think in many cases, this is not the only reason why, but I think in many cases, the reason why a lot of people who are successful is because they were able to see this like dream or goal or vision that they've got. And they were able to translate that into a set of steps that they could do, right? And everybody's set of steps is quite different. And I think a lot of people, they get overwhelmed. Like, if I was to say to you, okay, go and write, or whoever's watching this, go and write a book. If I was to say, go and write a book, that would feel like a huge, overwhelming task. But if I was to say, like, step one is pick a topic, step two, brainstorm, 10 different things you'd like to cover in that topic. Step three, choose the 4 elements of that topic that you think are most interesting, and kind of break it down into all these steps. I think people can achieve things that they would never previously be able to achieve when it's broken down into those different steps. So that's one element. I think this is a human thing. Web3 I am breathtakingly underqualified to talk about Web3. I really don't know a lot about it. I'm just not very excited about Web3. My wife keeps telling me I need to be more interested in this. And I think, but in my mind, like any big new thing in the world that we've seen in history, it's like the Wild West at the beginning, right? Like at the beginning of ebook readers, you had all these crazy devices that didn't work very well and had terrible battery life. At the beginning of electronic cars now, you got all kinds of random cars that aren't very good. And Web3 is kind of a new way of, I think, of building software and building technology. And consequently, you get all of this insanity around like NFTs and things like that. And a lot of these kinds of things will shake out in the mix, and some things will survive and some things won't survive. I think the notion of decentralization is interesting and exciting. I think most people don't care. I think technology people care, but my mom and dad couldn't care less, as an example. I think the idea of like NFT value, people paying for digital value, I just don't believe that is going to in any way scale up. But where I think it's particularly interesting is the notion of getting tokens or portions of a token as rewards for participating in a community. And that is a huge topic with a lot of minefields in it, because the minute you add any kind of financial incentive to any community, it can poison the well immediately. Immediately. Money. What's interesting to me is like, if you give $10 as a reward to someone in a community, all kinds of bad things can happen. But if you give someone something else that you paid $10 for, like a gift, it's a much different set of circumstances that can be much less dangerous. So just any kind of financial recognition in communities, unless you handle it really carefully, can cause all kinds of problems. So that's my only concern about it. Also, as a side note, I've noticed that my video keeps getting darker as I'm sat here. I don't know why. I think it's because it's becoming evening here. I've got loads of lights on, but it looks like I'm descending into a cave.
Thank you, thank you. I understand. Yeah, I felt similar things. Yeah.
Yes, slogans of decentralization is a very beautiful. I totally agree to the decentralization, but actual some decentralization activity sometimes more hard to governance and very hard to makes happy. Sometimes makes unhappy than traditional style centralization governance.
Yeah.
We should care for the value, not care for the slogans and functions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the only thing I would say very quickly is with all of this Web3 stuff, and some people who are Web3 fans will probably hate me for saying this, is whatever we're seeing right now in Web3, don't take any of it too seriously, because it's the Wild West, right? There's going to be some crazy stuff happening. Like, you know, like the guy who bought that first tweet that Jack put out on Twitter and paid millions of dollars for it, and then tried to auction it off and made no money from it. All this kind of lunacy is going to happen for a while as people figure out it's going to be crazy town, and then it's going to kind of level itself out, and then we'll be able to see what really works. You know, there are two types of ideas in the world. There's bad ideas and ideas worth testing, and we're testing the ideas with Web3 right now.
Thank you.
Now, reading your book, you explain how to create a community and make it successful, and that's great. But on the other hand, and it's convincing, on the other hand, there's another part of me that feels that, but community is always idiosyncratic. It depends on who actually comes on board. And some people are really energetic and exciting, and once they come on, the community starts to boom. And then there are other communities that if you do a lot of work, but then nothing actually happens. So would you say that you're just doing it wrong? If you do it right, Jonah Bacon way, you can have any community flourishing in 3 weeks, or would you say well, it's only about 70% hit rate, or what's your evaluation of your own methods?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, communities are they're not for everybody, right. And you know, there's going to be some people. So from the data that I've seen, about 1 in every 5 people in a community will be active. So you've got 100 people in your community who are showing up, and they come into your community platform. About 20 of them will be posting and responding and engaging and interacting.
Right. Yeah.
So by definition, that means that the vast majority of people who come into our communities are just consuming, they're just reading.
Right.
And that's fine. You know, it's always important to me to set the expectations, especially with companies who are building communities, that don't expect that 100% of everybody is going to be interacting and engaging. Now, for the people who interact and engage, by definition, they're going to have more of a community mindset. They wouldn't even bother posting in the community and interacting if they didn't have that mindset of like they're comfortable in an online setting. They feel like they can get value out of the discussion. They'd like to share with other people. But then I found that about 1 in every 100 people is what I would call a core community member. And that is somebody who is just super passionate and enthusiastic, like, you know, like your super fans, essentially. And they have a very unique personality that's very unusual. So what I like to do is to design the community to be a place where you attract the right kind of minds, the people, like, don't go after the people who only want to go to a help page and figure out the solution to their problem and then move on. Those people are probably not going to come into your community. I like to design a community for the kind of people who really enjoy interacting with other people, where they want to feel part of something, where they crave a sense of belonging. And especially for those disruptive communities where they feel like they're part of something. and you'll get you'll get better results. I wouldn't even bother trying to convince everybody to be a community member.
I see. Okay, where did I go?
Oh, I stopped my screen share. I will doing the screen share again. Okay.
Yeah. So I think probably we're starting to run out of time. So we should start answering questions from the audiences, I guess.
Cool.
Yeah. So these are more of opinion. So yeah. Especially one of the things is that, especially in Japan, Korea, you mentioned in the book that you work with some Japanese companies, but mostly in Japan, community is not a very high priority. It's usually located somewhere under human resources, and it's great while they are cheering for your product, but then after that, if they don't really work, who cares? So how important is community for the US and European companies? Do they have more presence? Is it considered more important in currently? I think this comes back to my first question about the why you wrote this book, but do you see businesses just incorporating community into their products or services much more than before? Do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a significant growth for a number of years now in companies being interested in building the communities around their businesses. And I think what they're seeing, the reason for this is because the relationship that consumers and customers have with brands is changing. Like when like 15, 20 years ago, if you had a problem with a product or a service, then you called like a phone number. And then we started seeing people having websites, and then people started interacting with customers via email. And, but it's all very one way, right? Like a company would communicate out to you, and then you could maybe call them and talk to a person, but that was about it. Whereas now people are growing up with Instagram and Twitter and TikTok and all these different platforms. And, 25 years ago, you couldn't have a relationship. You couldn't communicate with a celebrity, but now you can, right? So the scarcity element of the relationships we have with other people has changed. So therefore, I think a lot of companies realize that community is no longer a nice to have. They're a thing that you kind of have now. But it varies tremendously where they fit into businesses. I think there's a lot of people and there are a lot of companies who quite reasonably say, we want to have a community, and they see it in their head as like a forum or a platform or a chat channel where people are hanging out and they love your product, they love your service, you can reach out to them and engage with them. But the vast majority of companies, I think, have absolutely no idea how to get to that point. And that's one of the reasons why I focus so much of my time on writing books like People Powered and building like the Zero to Community Masterclass and things like that, is to really build as much predictable workflow to get them to success as possible. There are just good and bad places where a community department can live. In my mind, it should never live under HR, because to me, you want to have a community department be incentivized by the right model, right? So, for example, I worked with a client one time, and they weren't a good client because I knew they were struggling with community, but their community team, which was one person, and then they had like a contractor, reported into the legal department. And I was chatting to the CEO, and the CEO was like, what's the first change that we should make? And I said, well, the first thing is you've got to get them out of the legal department, which he was not expecting. And he said, it was like, well, why? Why should they not report into legal? And I said, well, your legal team are incentivized by reducing risk. right? So a lawyer is doing a great job when there is no risk attached to your company.
Right.
So lawyers are famous for not being creative or exciting. Lawyers don't do adventurous things. They don't do anything that's rock and roll. They are very, very boring people because that's what they're incentivized by. They're incentivized to reduce risk. So communities are supposed to be exciting and dynamic and a little dangerous. I was like, you need these people in marketing or engineering or something along those lines. So I think that's the key thing. The challenge, I think, where a lot of companies face with community is that some community managers are not able to translate the value of community into a model that executives can really wrap their head around. You know, and companies operate, you know, financial. The markers for success are often financials, share price, brand recognition, social acceptance. So I think community managers need to translate the value of the community into those kinds of numbers. And then I think executives will better understand it and better put it in the right department. So.
I see. And now one I had a conversation with a friend, and he was talking about his community. He was just rather suspicious about it, and his concern was that community. He was like, the community could be hijacked by some kind of a political movement. Let's say, cultural appropriation or LGBT or whatever, and it might revolt against the whole your product or service or anything, and it's really, really risky to have outside people having so much influence on you. And is that a concern, or is that something that you can avoid if you have a proper management of community?
Yeah, this is really interesting because you know how I was saying earlier on that kind of Web3 is crazy town right now because everybody's trying these new things. I think we're experiencing something similar with the balance of social movements like LGBTQ and businesses. So again, don't want to turn this into a political of course discussion here, but so I am very much in favor of LGBTQ rights, and my wife and I are like supporters of GLAAD and things like that. And I think we've been seeing lots of different examples of how those kinds of conversations have been existing in companies. In some companies, they're unionizing, and there's like a really stringent vision around this. And some you've got employee resource groups, and in others, you've just kind of not got a lot going on. And there's a culture war that's been erupting around this. And I think we'll figure out what the right balance is in making sure that, the staff that work for the company, and, there's a balance that you've got to see the whole person in my mind, but you also can't be in a position where the company is hijacked for anyone's political viewpoint in my mind. So the same risk can apply to communities. And I think the solution to this, which is uncomfortable, is you've just got to set really clear expectations with the group. I think where some companies have struggled is that they didn't set any expectations with their staff. And they said, we want to be this environment where we support and everybody's and just this really open environment. And then what happened is their employees went and did that, right? And they made a big chunk of the discussion at work be about these political elements. And then, the company starts kind of pushing back on that. And the staff are like, well, hang on a second. You told us that we could have this open environment. So, I think it's all about expectations. You have some companies like Coinbase, for example, where they said, there's no politics at work. That's the expectation, right? There's a middle ground between those 2 points. And I don't think we've figured it out yet. And we'll have the same question with communities. And I wish I had a framework, but I don't think we have one yet. But we'll get there. It's just the most important thing is that we listen to each other and we don't shout at each other as we're figuring out that framework.
Okay. Another question is about, okay, do you feel that metaverse would change the community in the future, or would they have any effect on the community? That's the question.
I guess it depends on what we define as the metaverse. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what it is. I mean, if it's this kind of virtual VR world where we're all connected, I am not convinced that is going to take off at all. And the reason why is because I think people don't like sitting with headsets on. When you put a VR headset on, even if it's thin and light and weighs next to nothing, there's something baked into us as human beings where when you cut off someone's vision, your amygdala just starts going crazy. It just starts firing that like there is risk nearby. And I'm not convinced that that's gonna be successful. What I think the metaverse will be is going to be AR, where you're seeing the world and information is overlaid on regular glasses, because then you don't have that issue. And I think that will become as connected as our existing world. I think information and social experiences will become deeply connected. But then the thing we'll need to figure out then is we're going to be this weird position where people are going to have cameras on their glasses in social scenarios. We saw this with Google Glass, and people called those people glass holes, which is, I think, in some cases, a reasonable description. But who knows? We'll see. We'll figure it out.
I see. And another question is about, okay, in your book, chapter 10, and you mentioned a lot of KPIs about how to evaluate the activeness of the community. And one of them was like the increasing the answer rate to the questions. And one of that, how exactly would you want to do that? The person who questioned said that maybe the manager himself can actually go around and he or she could answer all the questions that come online, or you need to design a system that other people would want to answer a question. Probably some kind of a point system or reward system would be something like that. Or maybe the community manager can act as some kind of a DJ and try to draw people in, like for this question, maybe Mr. Takasu could answer. That kind of active participation would work. What's your recommendation?
Yeah, so I think looking at questions answered, so Q&A is one of the biggest functional benefits of the community. We see this in almost every community, people asking questions and people getting responses. And I think that it's a good metric because in many businesses, one key cost center is support, where you have to pay people to support your product or your service. So when that happens in a community, that's great. It's a real benefit, but we need a number to be able to state that the value. Now, there are some platforms where you can do this, like Discourse, for example. If you ask a question, somebody provides a response, so you can mark that as the solution, and then that metric can then be tracked. In other cases, I've seen many of my clients, when they've got communities on Discord or Slack and places like that, essentially what they'll do is they'll mark, they've got a bot, and they'll say, okay, that was a Q&A discussion, and then the last 50 lines of text will be snipped out and then will be essentially rewritten, and that will go into a frequently asked questions type list. I think there are very simple ways of doing it, and I would strongly recommend everybody do it. One of the big problems with chat channels versus forums is if you ask a question on a forum and it gets a response, you mark it as the solution, that then gets indexed on Google if it's a public community or whatever search engine you've got. Whereas with chat channels, it's a linear stream of consciousness. So what you need to do is you need to snip out those pieces and put them on a separate platform where they can be documented. If you don't document those Q&A, then all that amazing insight that's in your community is not getting reused, and it's really important that we reuse it.
I see. I see. Another question was about what do you think about the relationship between various communities? Do you sort of initiate some kind of joint events with other communities of other products? I think that will depend a lot on what kind of community or what kind of service or product you're talking about. But have you ever done that kind of joint event with other communities of other products or that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that a lot of communities will do. Like, to your point, it kind of depends a little bit on the product or the area. One thing that's very common in the marketing world, in the sales world, are affiliate programs and joint venture programs. Where you will promote something else to your audience. And it's a really powerful way of doing something similar for communities as well, where you create a joint venture. The difference with joint venture in sales and marketing is usually there's a financial component to it. If you're selling a $1,000 product, then in many cases in joint venture programs in sales and marketing, you have to pay up to 50% commission. Whereas in community, typically there's no commission. It's just a means of you need to find an alignment with your audience. But a great way of doing that is just getting more people into your community. Like if you've got a community that's focused on a webinar platform, then, doing a joint community event with somebody who is maybe an event organization platform could be a good thing to do. So, yeah.
So I think we are 5 minutes left, and I think Mr. Takasu, we have no more questions. So wrap up, I guess.
Yes. First of all, very thanks for the meaningful conversation about the people powered books and more truly broadly the mean in the community.
And that was really a lot of fun. Thank you very much for your participation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, by the way. This was awesome. Great questions. So,
you want to say something else?
Yes, and the last question of the event, I found some your experience work with Japanese company. Please more add comment your experience about more Japanese organization, Japanese community with your business.
Yeah, so this is gonna be a call to action, because I've been to Japan once. I went to Tokyo, and I absolutely loved it. And I had such a great time and such incredibly friendly people. And I would like to come again. And the likelihood of me coming over is much more likely when I've got a client in Japan. Unfortunately, a lot of my clients are based in the US and Europe. So yeah, if anyone wants to work with me, I would love to come to your country. What I found fascinating, I've limited experience in working with Japanese communities, but what I found fascinating is that with communities, the principles are the same all over the world, from what I can see. It's is that when you create an environment where people feel like they belong and they get a lot of value out of it, you will see that everywhere. What I found interesting was when I went to Japan, my one and only time, I was warned by the folks who I was working with. I was doing some training for a big tech company in Japan. I can't say who it was. And I was told that that in Japan, people are very quiet in these kinds of sessions. They won't ask a lot of questions and don't interpret that as them being rude towards me. So I was expecting a quite boring experience, that there was just me talking. There's going to be no response. I had the opposite. The opposite of that was lots of questions, lots of smiles, people making jokes, people being very social and friendly. To me, the community, the human condition that's needed to make a thriving community, everyone who I've met in Japan just oozes that. Like it's baked into the Japanese psyche in my mind. So, more so than some other places I've been. So, I think there's amazing opportunity for community. And the other thing which I loved about my experience in Tokyo was such pride of being Japanese as well. And I think that's so powerful in communities where, especially where so many communities online are in English. But if you've got a community that's focused in Japanese, that sense of like, translating is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So just being able to connect and engage with people in your own native tongue, I think it builds a real sense of unity.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Nice.
Good. Okay, thanks for joining in this event. Please keep in touch about talk about the community.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Appreciate
you very
it.
much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Great. Bye.
Okay, I quit the meeting. Thank you for that. Thanks all. Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you for joining.